everybody. Thank you, James. Cool. Welcome, everybody. At Jump, we basically don't do anything without collecting some data first. So before we start speaking about engaging and acquiring users simultaneously, I want to ask all of you a question, and that is, how many of you, can you please raise your hands if you do remember the last app that you've downloaded? Well, that's not too bad. I guess you guys are clicking on banners from our competitors. How many of you remember the last app that you've actually used? That seems to be a bit more, doesn't it? It's two very simple questions, but it gives you an idea of what's happening. Obviously, it's much easier to remember something that you have used rather than something that you've just downloaded. And that is reflected by the typical user acquisition reality. Basically, if you look at that retention curve, it's just a standard retention curve you can find anywhere in the internet. But it's a reality. You buy users, you make them download and install your app, and the next day they're gone. Users come and they go faster than you can say engagement. So it actually looks like a good reason to panic, but we suggest not to panic, but look into some more data at this stage and really define what are the different stages that those users are in. And what we ask you to actually accomplish is to look at that curve and then lift that entire curve up in parallel. And that is what we mean by acquiring and engaging users simultaneously. If you just look at acquisition, you're just looking at the front end of the curve. You might be able to change that angle for a bit, but you're not changing the entire form and the entire shape of that curve. So it's going to be some very heavy lifting, that's for sure. And before you guys break your back, we suggest that you seek some expert advice to help you with it, and that's what we're here for. Because you are really looking at a rather complex 4-piece puzzle game. And first in that puzzle game, we're looking at data, a lot of data. Data that's actually going to help you to better understand your user lifecycle. You're going to look at that lifecycle to understand and define very specific segments that you're then going to speak to individually. And you're going to have to define and execute a strategy that's going to help you to approach each of these segments with individual messages at the right time. So let's look at the first step, which is data analysis. Today, and that was also in 2013, but it's now a commodity always, clients do have very powerful tracking partners. Unfortunately, we're seeing that most of you guys are buying a Porsche, which is great, but some of you never shift in second gear. So if you have that very powerful tracking solution in place, then really make it work for you and collect a lot of data and not just the data, attributing an install. Because what you're really looking for is that one sweet moment that changes an installer into a user. And it's not always very clear what that precise moment is. So you have to look in your app and at every single user individually and consolidate that data to identify where is that point, and then try to make that point happen, not for some of your users, but for as many as possible. So what we're looking at is really an entire user life cycle that is not just install and then buy, but it's actually much longer. It leads you from an install over the first usage, over a registration, over several product views, and eventually there's going to be a purchase or whatever it is that you're trying to achieve with your app. And hopefully there's going to be some reorders. Be aware, though, in pushing those users forward in that channel, and if you're thinking of user acquisition and engagement as two separate things, eventually you're going to be defeated by time. So we think that time is a critical thing when trying to engage your users, and you need to make up your mind when you really want to get them. Let's just go through some examples of that life cycle. I think we all agree an install is a great thing because a user that has installed your app must have felt some kind of relevancy. Either he wouldn't have downloaded the app, right? So that's a great thing. But basically, I compare it as a user that's just looking at a storefront window. It's good to have that person there, but in order to make him come in, you need to do something more, right? So it's really important to memorize. user acquisition is not just getting people in front of your store window, but it is about making them come in. And that moment of entering a store in some cases might feel a bit awkward, right? And it's actually the same as with using an app, right? For some apps, the moment of activation requires, for instance, completing a registration, so you need to give away some personal data, which feels awkward for some people. Or just take another example, ordering your very first taxi on a taxi app might feel difficult for you because you really need that taxi. What if this app doesn't work? So it's something that you need to convince users to do, and you need to engage them to actually do that very precise step. Finally, if you have them in your app and you have them activated for the very first time, you need to engage them over time. You need to make them fill up their baskets. You need to make sure that they experience all the brilliant features that your app has, and you need to talk to them constantly in order to make that happen, or they just go away. And that is actually the reality. Just be aware, whatever stage those users are, at some stage they might be walking away. And in walking away, they're going straight to competitor land. And what's even more important, the further they go away and the more time passes between their last interaction, the more likely it is that they've actually forgotten your app. The more difficult it is to find them back, and the more expensive it is for you to reactivate them. So what we're trying to do is we're trying to identify very specific segments along that user life cycle to define a specific message and to define the right time at which to approach them. And this is just a very generic example here, but basically all users at some stage are new users. Only when they open the app for the first time, we call them one-timers. And somewhere on the way between being a one-timer until actually being engaged with the app is that one activation moment, that golden moment that you need to nail. And that's exactly what we're trying to do. Later on, hopefully, those users will become buyers and engaged users. But be aware that each and every single segment always have a fallback to the group of dormant users. A user that has just installed your app might never use it, become a lapsed and dormant user. A one-time user very quickly goes away and never comes back, dormant user. Even an engaged user might at some stage forget your app if you don't succeed to engage him with the right content. And even a buyer might never come back at some stage. So the reality is that in all of those different segments, most of the times the dormant segment is even the biggest one. So don't forget about it as well. That's a blank slide. Cool. Which brings us to finding and identifying the right strategies, which again is a difficult thing because I assume most of you are living in a world of restricted budgets. If you don't, speak to me as well. If you do, we might have to talk a bit longer because then we'll need to define, again, the right segments, the right messages, and the right timing to approach of those users, each and every one with an individual message. So if you're looking back at those different segments and the different stages in the life cycle that we have, we feel that every single time and for every single segment, there's the perfect message. And we're trying to find out that message and deliver it to your clients. So some examples. Again, the critical time is that moment from where a user changes from a first or one-time user to becoming an engaged user. And there's different examples for that. For instance, for a food delivery app here, that might be the first time a user actually searches for his favorite dish. And that's very cool, because once you know his favorite dish, you can show it to him over and over again. The main point here is that activating your user for the first time is time critical and is something that you need to do as fast as possible. So once you have a user download your app, you might find in your data that it's very well worthwhile to wait for him to get activated just 1 or 2 days. But after that, you need to find him back quick, because the longer you wait, the further he walks away. And then the message is really, this is the sweet thing that my app does for you, try it. Once you have those users activated, don't stop talking to them. You need to push them forward in the entire conversion funnel, and you want to make them buy, order, book, whatever it is that your app is trying to achieve. There's some more time revealed, and the frequency in which you need to talk to users might change as well. You might also note that we're using dynamic content banners here. We're basically taking care that we learn the individual browsing activity of your users in your app, and that we take up that content, actually put it into a banner to offer a user some more information on what he should do. So for instance, if you work for a travel app, and if you have users that have been looking for connections from, say, Berlin to Munich, we might actually show that in the banner, and we might actually even show him some specific pricing included in that. So that's definitely the thing to do. Lastly, all of that boils down to actually allocating your budget wisely. And again, the idea is don't first work in user acquisition and then work in retention, but the idea is to do it simultaneously. And if you have a flat budget over time, then your allocation might be looking something like that. The idea behind that is your short-term activation budget, and we sometimes call that the app loop budget. That's a budget which is a function of your user acquisition budget. If you're paying a lot of money to acquire new users, you need to reserve a fraction of that budget to actually engage them short-term. That's what we call the app loop budget, and it's here the yellow line. On top of that, we ask you to invest some more money into re-engagement and retargeting of those users. This is basically speaking to those dormant and lapsed users. And that budget is really a function of your entire user base. So over time, your user acquisition budget might somewhat get smaller, whilst all of the engagement and retargeting budgets will grow over time. Obviously, if you have different seasonalities in your marketing planning, then we'll take care of that as well. It's not just having a flat line, that's just one example. But there's one more thing that's somewhere hidden in the slide. First, I've been asking you guys to think about user acquisition and engagement as a simultaneous activity. Now, secondly, I'm also going to suggest to do it with one and the same supplier, which is some sort of a pitch, I guess. But there's also a reason for that. Obviously, when re-engaging your users, you're doing that with RTB traffic, so traffic that's being traded in real time. The advantage of RTB traffic as compared to typical CPI bot traffic is that you have much, much more targeting abilities. And what we're actually doing in those re-engagement campaigns is, once we find out that there's a very cool publisher that has very high engagement rates with your users, then the next and very smart step is actually to take that publisher and use that precise publisher for user acquisition as well. So that's just one of the examples where we are learning from our engagement campaigns to acquire new users as well. So it's some sort of a closed circle that is over time feeding itself with more knowledge, more data, and more learnings. So this all wouldn't be worthwhile if we wouldn't have some actual results for you. That is one curve that I've taken from a real campaign, actually. That's a campaign in Europe. And what we're seeing is that comparing a standalone user acquisition campaign to a user acquisition and engagement campaign does really shape the curve. So what we're doing here is, by basically improving the user acquisition targeting, we're somewhat changing the curve, or the angle of the top left curve. It's somewhat shifting outside. And then, but the much more important part is really we're actually lifting up that curve towards the ceiling. So you're getting a much higher rate of engaged users over time, and these users are much more sticky. So thus, we're increasing relevancy in the messages that we're sending your users. We're increasing conversion rates across the entire funnel, and what's more, we're improving your return on your marketing invest. And that's basically for me. I hope you guys have some questions. If you don't dare to ask them right now, I'm here for the rest of the day, and I'm really keen to be talking to you individually.